Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming to our breakout on offshore drilling. I'm Jackie Savitz. I'm Senior Campaign Director for Oceana's Climate and Energy Campaign, for those of you that don't know me. We have a really exciting panel today. I think you're going to enjoy it. We're looking at offshore drilling, sort of the past, how we got where we are today, the present, where are we today, and the future, how do we move forward from where we are. Richert is a veteran on this issue, Senior Policy Advisor at the Defenders for Wildlife. And I think at last count he had 32 years in working on this issue, which I think pretty much outstrips all the rest of us in the room. And Richard's going to talk about sort of how we got where we are today on offshore drilling. I heard him talking about this during the spill and thought it was fascinating and thought it might be a good way to get us started. From Richard, we're going to move on to Linda Lance, who is the counsel to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and she's going to talk about what's happening on the Hill, basically, which will, I think, be a good setup. From Linda, we're going to go to John Amos, who's the founder of Skytruth, and you've already seen some of John's excellent imagery in some of the plenary sessions. He is a master of using imagery to document what's happening out there, and was very instrumental in us seeing some pictures of what was going on during the Gulf spill. And he's got some great shots for you today that I think are also very, very telling. And John's going to talk about, what was that great title you had? Could it happen again?
Can we avoid the next disaster?
Yeah, how do we avoid the next disaster, which I think is a very good question. And then I'm going to finish up talking about the future and actually propose a plan for how we alleviate the need to continue drilling in the Gulf of Mexico by 2020. So with that, I'll introduce Richert Charter.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the founding of our nation. In America, we had founders who decided that we were going to have respect for individual freedom, we were going to have a cultural advancement, and we were going to, among other things, respect our natural heritage. In the process of doing that, they set in motion a number of things. They created this core value of natural heritage protected for future generations. And it took until 1872 when my great-great-uncle Ulysses S. Grant signed the documents that created the first national park on land, terrestrial preservation. Yosemite took from 1864, when Abe Lincoln began to understand that logging and sheep herding and mining were going to threaten Yosemite National Park. It took then from 1864 to 1890 to get Yosemite done. But we began to go offshore in about 1980 in response to a gentleman named James Watt, who looked like Alfred E. Newman and thought like a Tea Partier, and he was going to drill absolutely everywhere. So that launched a 27-year bipartisan, and I stress bipartisan, congressional moratorium that protected the Atlantic, the Pacific coast, and Bristol Bay in Alaska, and a broad swath of the coast of Gulf Coast of Florida. That lasted until 2008. That really came about because of something that happened in Santa Barbara in 1969 called the Santa Barbara Blowout, which is largely credited, along with the publication of Silent Spring, with the birthplace of the modern-day environmental movement. The Santa Barbara Blowout, I think, was the key to that 27-year moratorium. But as you've noticed in this nation, we also forget lessons that we've learned from technological failures, as well as lessons that we've learned from ill-advised conflict throughout the planet. But we did have the noted environmentalist George Herbert Walker Bush add to that moratorium with presidential deferrals, executive deferrals, because under Section 12 of the operative legislation, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, it is possible for a president to just take something off the table. And then we had another wake-up call last year, and in that wake-up call, John provided us with this photograph, which is about 1 year ago. It's May 23rd. We found out that not only could you have accidents with offshore drilling that you couldn't clean up, you actually couldn't stop them. And we watched Wile E. Coyote run around on behalf of BP there for the first month or two, trying to hit Roadrunner was the giant cap and the various devices that didn't work, and they all had acne printed on the side. None of them worked, and when I used to walk into my kitchen and find 3 little boys running out the doors because there was a quart of milk in the middle of the floor, I learned that there can be accountability problems. In fact, the dog had suddenly developed an opposable thumb and learned to open the fridge. In the case of the Gulf of Mexico, when it looked like this, the oil companies and their operators all engaged in a circular finger-pointing motion. The changing of the name of the Minerals Management Service, which had been associated in Colorado with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the changing of the name happened so fast that they picked a acronym that is BUMMER. And the White House declared that all this oil had disappeared one weekend, overnight. I think it went into Carol Browner's purse, from what I could understand on Good Morning America. So we began to see the oil industry respond to all this and say, let's blame the president. We can't let them blame the oil industry for the worst environmental disaster. Obviously, Congress wasn't moving quickly. So they got one of their name that type of Coca-Cola companies to decide to call it, I think they went back to ancient Latin and looked at the word vomitorium and decided they would call it the Obamatorium, blame the White House for rising gas prices and the accident. And in 1 year, they reprogrammed the American public from the accident in the Gulf to the drilling ban at the White House. It's the most amazing thing. And in that year, another one happened called Vermilion, which didn't kill anybody or spread much oil, but a platform again caught fire in the Gulf. It happens on average each year about 10 times each year. And so the Congress decided that rather than respond to the Gulf spill with something constructive, 2 weeks ago, they passed legislation in the House of Representatives to open Santa Monica Bay, Acadia National Park, coast of Georgia, Outer Banks, Florida, Alaska, Arctic Ocean, open everything past the House 2 weeks ago. And then this week, on Tuesday night, the Senate failed to reach sufficient votes for cloture on a bill to take away the oil industry's free taxpayer-funded tax breaks and incentives. And on Wednesday night, the Senate failed to achieve cloture on a similar drill baby drill bill in the Senate. It was the biggest victory, I think, in the Senate in the last 10 years. It was very significant, but they will be back in the Senate. And Linda's going to describe to you the offshore drilling promotion that we're going to see as early as this week in the U.S. Senate. The White House decided that maybe they were no longer on the right side, and so last Saturday they changed their mind for the 5th time and said maybe we could we could accelerate the planning process off the mid and South Atlantic coast. This is the 5th time this administration has changed their mind on offshore drilling, and they will, in the next few weeks, make an announcement about whether they're going to allow Shell to begin drilling in the Arctic Ocean. This is what cleanup would look like in the Arctic Ocean. I suggest we all buy stock in a company that manufactures toothbrushes, because it will, if oil gets under the ice, the only way you can track oil under the ice sheet is, I kid you not, with dachshunds. That's the only way. They put a little GPS on the back of the dachshund and they can smell the oil under the ice. And cleanup in the ice has just never been invented. We, as a nation, have ignored a current priority, and that is called marine spatial planning. And you're going to hear a lot about that at this conference. The current status of marine spatial planning in this country looks like this. This is not a PowerPoint slide that failed to load. This is a national priority that never made it to prime time. As a result of all the things I just described, on the 25th of June there will be an event around the world called Hands Across the Sand. You may remember this from last year, in which hundreds of thousands of people in 32 countries joined hands on beaches across the reflecting pool. There'll be one here in Washington, there'll be one in every state, and if you go to handsacrossthesand.org, you will learn how you can help organize Hands Across the Sand in your community on June 25th. And I'll save the rest for questions, but thank you very much.
On time. Good job. Thanks, Richard. Linda?
Yeah, thanks for coming by and listening to my tale of woe. I'll just give you a little bit of context about where I work. I'm with the Senate Energy Committee. We have jurisdiction over the Department of the Interior, basically. So we've been working for the last year on response to the spill, on legislation that is focused primarily on safety. The department, of course, has some environmental responsibilities when they decide where to lease. So we're looking at that as well. I work for Senator Bingaman, who's been the chair of the Energy Committee for a long time. He is a pragmatist above all else, and his heart is very much in the right place, but he's a legislator. And I guess the message that I want to bring to you today is don't forget about us legislators, because this is serious business now. This is not funny. What's going on up there is not funny, and bad things can happen in the short term. So it is true that energy policy is a long-term gig, and we ought to figure out how to do it well in the long term, and there's a lot of work going on there. It's very hard. The politics are very hard. They're not just partisan, although they're very much partisan right now. They're also regional. People are all about how their constituents make money. All the people that make money off oil and gas aren't Republicans. So Mary Landrieu sits on our committee. She rarely votes with the chairman, for example. I guess what I want to talk to you about is how I feel like it's working up there in the real world right now, and where I think the opportunities are to increase the level of activity for those of you who care about this being done right. And I guess I'm working in this sort of narrower world, so I want to bring you into that as well. You know, I have to work in a world where you can't say, let's save the ocean. You have to say, how are we going to design a well in this kind of geology that works? And how can we make sure that when the Interior Department permits in the, Newt Gingrich administration 2 decades from now, they're not going to backslide from where they are now. Footnote, I think I personally think the Interior Department, who was absolutely heartbroken and horrified by what happened, and there were some good people working there. It isn't just the people playing cards and drinking in Denver, right? And there were just a few of them. Although these people in the Gulf who permit these wells, they're mostly good public servants. There just aren't very many of them. They've never had the resources they need. So, they're working hard to get back to the right place, but, and the Secretary has a lot of discretion under current law to do the right thing. But they're not always going to, this administration is not always going to be in office. So whether you like or don't like what they're doing, I think it's important to have legislation that will set a bar at a certain level so that everybody has to meet that bar, regardless of who's president. So that's where we've been, that's the space we've been working in. And it's focused on, initially on the safety of the well, which I think is an environmental issue. And John and Richard were incredibly helpful to us when we started this work on the spill, but I think we all have to admit that none of us had much experience working in this space, including the advocacy community. So these guys had a skill set that we needed to work in that space, but they were pretty much by themselves. And we talked about this earlier, there's very little investment over the years by the nonprofit community in this kind of work, and whether the development offshore is going to be safe. Because everyone wanted to move down the road and say, well, we won't have any offshore development. Well, in a perfect world, yes, but I don't think anybody can argue for the next couple of decades, we're going to develop domestic oil and gas. That's just the way it is. So I guess I'm here to make a pitch for you all also working in the more short-term space to say, how can we make that safe? And how can we fight off some of these extreme proposals that we're seeing now? Because if they pass, and they could, once you punch those holes, you're done. And even if we wean ourselves off of oil in 20 years, we still punch those holes in places that are really pristine now. I guess I would urge both, a visionary approach, which the community is very good at having and advocating, and also a pragmatic approach in the short term. Because here's what's happening up on the Hill right now. We had this really good vote on the McConnell bill this week, but the reason it was such a good vote is because we got some people who definitely don't agree with us, but are so far right that this very extreme bill was not extreme enough for them. So you can't count on those people, right? And we got Mary Landrieu not because she doesn't think we should drill everywhere, but because this wasn't sending enough money home to her state. It was keeping it for the federal treasury. So when you see these votes, they're usually more complicated than they appear, and you can't take them to the bank. So, I mean, I think I'm here to sound an alarm, which is the world I live in now, unfortunately, sorry, that we're not done with these really hard votes. And these proposals are extreme. They're mandating that the current law requires a certain amount of process, and it's actually fairly extensive process. My boss always says, I don't think Congress should be telling anybody to drill or not drill. I think the science should tell you that, and the agencies are the ones who have the capacity usually to bring that to the table. I think you can make an argument that this administration is trying pretty hard to bring science to the table, and there is process in place. So that's why these really extreme proposals are trying to take that away from the agency and say, you must drill here, you must lease here within 1 year. Not you have to look at it, but we're going to decide for you based on nothing that you have to lease here. That's the kind of proposal. That was what the McConnell bill did. It also said the agency has to complete its work on a well permit, including these ultra deep water, very complicated wells within 60 days. If they don't, it's deemed approved. Deemed approved. That's unprecedented. And we beat it back only because we got a couple of people from the far right who didn't think that was enough. So these are difficult times, and I'm in the Senate. The House is much worse. The House is passing all of these bills. The Hastings bill that did a lot of this is sitting on the Senate calendar. If we pass it, it goes to the president. So I'm saying this, I know we're not having fun now, but I'm saying it because here's what's missing, I think. Richard's absolutely right. The oil industry, this is what they do. They're not going to stop, and they're going to bring all the power that they have to bear to get this moving along. They believe in their heart, rightly or wrongly, that this permit process is too slow, that all this process is too cumbersome, that things should move faster. So they're coming after this with everything they've got, and they've got a lot. And one of the things that they do is they pump out things that look like facts. And it's very, very difficult to run behind them and correct it, or better yet, get out in front of it. And I think all of us who work this know what the facts are that people need to understand. And I sort of still do believe that if people could understand what the facts are, the public is not stupid. Some of them are, but most of them aren't. But they don't have access to the facts, and they've got a busy life, and et cetera. So one of the goals that I have, and you guys could really be helpful with this, all of you folks who have technical expertise and backgrounds in these areas, you've got to work these issues. You've got to work them in that space. In addition to working for 30 years from now, let's wean ourselves off of oil. Because if you don't, the game's over in 30 years. So we really need people who can work the technical side of it, who can help us make sure we understand the facts and get them out there. And I feel like that's been really powerful already, because the last time I worked on this, when we had high gas prices, we were completely rolled. All the moratoriums were lifted. It was a total home run for the people that were saying, we need to produce more domestic oil and gas to bring the gas price down. Of course, we all know it's not going to bring the gas price down. We can never bring gas prices down by producing more domestic oil and gas. We just don't have enough. But it totally worked because it's sort of intuitive to people, and the facts weren't out there for them. This time, I think we did a much better job of getting the facts out fast, and they were seeing Libya on TV, so they sort of understood, well, maybe it's because of this. Maybe it's not because of we're not drilling enough offshore. I think we made progress there, and I think the best efforts of the Republican Party to say you should unelect President Obama because he's raised gas prices, because he's not drilling enough domestic oil and gas, I don't think that's working. The polls don't indicate that it's working. And part of that is because facts actually do matter. They're necessary, not sufficient sometimes. So anyway, that's one area that I really urge people to get more engaged in. There's a huge vacuum there. And the second one is for the advocacy community to work in the short-term space as well as the long-term space. Because people who've worked oceans haven't had to work these issues. They haven't been in danger until, the last 5 years or so. But I'm here to tell you where I sit, and granted, I may be a little too close to this, a little too freaked out, but they're in danger now. So we're going to mark up, and so what's happening on the Hill, we had these floor votes. I think we're done with that for a bit, but we're not done with it for the Congress. We're going to mark up our safety bill. We're going to try to on Thursday of this week. This is a bill that came out of our committee unanimously last year, and many of you might say, well, it's a modest bill, it's moderate, it's really not worth working for. It's going to set a floor for safety with this wells and with the leasing process, so that future administrations can't backslide. I think it's fairly sophisticated. We've done a lot of work on it with a lot of experts. It would be really helpful if it would pass. It can't pass without help, without major help. And so I think a lot of people in the community have said, well, that's not that interesting. We're moving on to the other things. Then we can't pass it, because already some of the Republicans who supported it last time are backsliding. I'm not sure where we're going to be in committee. And it can pick up a lot of heinous amendments if we're not careful, in which case we'll have to let it go. So that's sort of the next thing for us in the Senate. We're going to mark that up. In a perfect world, we'd like to see this thing move by itself. And that's the pitch we're making to the Republicans we're working with. Do the production stuff over here. Let's fight that other red meat, heinous fight over here. Just let the safety stuff go. And to us, that would be an important step one. So that's what we're working on. I'm hoping we'll get to it. We have a markup Thursday. We got a lot of work between here and there. If we don't finish marking it up because we lose a quorum, then we'll try it again next month. And what's coming up on the floor is anybody's guess. This is a very big moving target. The politics are shifting very, very fast. Richard's exactly right. The politics did a 180 from when I worked on this last year in the midst of the spill. Nobody would have had the nerve to vote against a safety bill in the midst of that spill. Well, we do now. And the Republican Party wants them to vote against it because they don't want to support anything that the Obama administration does, because they're looking down the road to the presidential election. So that's my tale of woe, and I thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you about how we can work on this.
Thanks, Linda. That's really useful, and I think creates a lot of fodder for some Q&A maybe at the end. So think about your questions. John?
I'm afraid I'm not going to cheer people up. I'm going to stand up, though.
Am I in the way?
No, you're good. So at Skytruth, we produce imagery of environmental issues to investigate what's happening, also to communicate to people what's happening. And I'm going to give you kind of a whirlwind tour of context. You know, why should you all care about the politics and get involved in this issue? So we are going to start way back in 2005. Hurricane Katrina and Rita went through the Gulf of Mexico as Category 5 storms when they were hitting the offshore oil fields. And we saw over 100 platforms totally destroyed by those storms. 450 seafloor pipeline breaks were reported. And based on a report from the Coast Guard, about 9 million gallons were spilled from damaged offshore facilities, platforms and pipelines, and damaged coastal infrastructure, refineries and storage tanks. Just a couple of years later, bam, Hurricane Ike hit the Texas coast near Galveston, and we saw another ugly reminder that coastal infrastructure that is necessary to support offshore drilling is a vulnerable thing. And it takes a long time to fix this stuff when it breaks. This ugly little image is a NASA satellite image taken 10 days ago. That green blob at the upper left is the tail end of the Mississippi Delta. That kind of comma-shaped white streak in the middle is an 18-mile-long oil slick. And it's not a one-off oil slick. That's a chronic oil slick. We see that on dozens of satellite images. It's actually caused by a cluster of wells on the seafloor in that location that were damaged by Hurricane Ivan. Anybody remember when Hurricane Ivan was? 2004. They're still working to plug the leak from those wells, and we're coming up on 7 years. In 2009, we saw this off the coast of Australia. And well, some of us did. A lot of people kind of blew it off, didn't think this was important. But what this was a blowout at a brand new offshore drilling rig and production platform in shallow water, about 250 feet deep, off the coast of Australia, operated by a multinational drilling contractor based in Norway, the safest drilling country in the world. That spill took them 10 weeks to drill a relief well to get that spill under control. We estimate at least 9 million gallons, and that is a very lowball conservative estimate on our part, at least 9 million gallons of oil spilled during that time, making it Australia's worst drilling-related spill in their history. Well, we thought people might want to hear about that here in the U.S. because we thought the oil business is a global business. The same people drilling off Australia that had that problem are drilling right now in the Gulf of Mexico. Very same company. Same contractors, Halliburton, that blew the cement job on that well that contributed to the blowout, blew the cement job on BP's well in 2010 that led to that blowout. Turns out cementing is the tricky thing to do. In fall of 2009, I testified to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. The media had largely ignored this Australia spill for the entire 10-week duration of the event. And a few of the politicians in attendance weren't particularly pleased with the message I had to bring to the floor that day. We were assured by some of these politicians.
This is something you don't want to do, though, as politicians. She's photographed with this poster.
Well, yeah, she's photographed with this poster. And what she's saying about that flaming oil rig off Australia, she was saying, and this is a quote, "Oh, these things happen." That is a quote. You can find it in the streaming video from that hearing. She was essentially saying that's impossible here in the U.S. with the tremendous regulation and fine technology that we have, because of course we all know Australia is a ass-backwards third world country that doesn't give a shit about the environment, right? So that was the implication. In fact, she went so far as to say I did a great disservice to the American people with my fear-mongering about the risks of drilling. 5 months later, in her backyard, we had an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon rig. It killed 11 people, injured 17 others. That rig burned out of control for 2 days until it finally sank 40 miles offshore in water a mile deep on Earth Day, of all things. And within days, our satellite imagery told us we had a massive oil spill going on, much bigger than we were being told at the time. And in fact, within the first week, I realized that this spill had exceeded the official estimate of the Exxon Valdez spill. The official estimate was 11 million gallons for Exxon Valdez. We had surpassed that in the first week. Little did I know, little did we know, that it would take 12 weeks to bring this spill under control. That well wasn't stopped until July 15th. And in that time, an estimated 172 million gallons of oil spilled directly into the Gulf of Mexico, making it not only the nation's worst oil spill, but the world's worst accidental oil spill. Okay, wow, here we are a year later. What's changed? And what I'm going to say now is not intended to be a comprehensive rundown of everything that's changed. I'm just going to kind of hit what I see as the significant highlights. Industry formed this corporation called the Marine Well Containment Corporation. The charge of that organization was to design and build and deploy as quickly as possible a device that would allow you to cap a blown out well on the seafloor. Another group, competing group, the Helix Well Containment Group, also came into being. Here's a photograph of a small part of the device that they have assembled. Its design, the design of both of these is based largely on the final successful capping stack that BP used to stop the well in July 2010. These are rated to work in water depths up to 8,000 feet. We'll come back to that in a second. The companies estimate when they get the call on the hotline, it'll take at least 2 to 3 weeks to assemble these things, get them shipped out of the Houston Equipment Yard, and get them out to sea and get them deployed. 2 to 3 weeks at a Macondo well rate of spillage. That's the BP spill. That means you're going to have at least 60 million gallons in the water before these things even arrive on the scene. Okay, so what's changed in government? Well, legislative branch of government is easy. They've done nothing, absolutely nothing. Actually, as Linda has told us, they've done worse than nothing because the House did pass this bill that, if it becomes law, will significantly undercut the federal government's ability to ensure safe drilling. I can't stress that enough. I think Secretary Bromwich of Bomer actually called it a suicide pact if this bill becomes law. Bomer evolved out of the ashes of the Minerals Management Service. It's the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement, in case anybody wanted to know. They reorganized MMS when they created BOMER and split the revenue generating section apart from the leasing and drilling oversight sections. They've issued thousands of pages of guidance to industry. And in particular, they've issued two new requirements, NTL 6 and NTL 10, notice to lessee, and the 06's requires operators to come up with a worst case scenario and show you their calculations and assumptions. And they never had to do this before. What's the worst case? What's the worst thing that could happen if things go wrong on your well? Now they're required to do that. This is a real positive step forward because anybody can look at their calculations and assumptions and critique that. They also have to say, based on that worst case scenario, they have to certify that they have the ability to effectively respond should the worst case occur. And they have to lay out some detail about how they actually would plan to do that. This sounds great. It's a little bit weak in implementation of the permits that have been approved. I've noticed a lot of the operators are getting by with this language. We hereby certify that we are able to effectively respond to the, quote, maximum extent practicable, unquote. Are there any attorneys in the audience? Is that phrase worth a damn? It's an undefined thing, practicable. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do in terms of pinning down specifics. And finally, NTL 10 has a lot of things in it that are good. They require a professional engineer to sign off on the well plan. They require training and certification of workers for safety. They also require a whole bunch of things that certify that your blowout preventer is operating properly, it's being tested regularly, and it will work as designed. That also sounds great, except one of the investigations of the BOP, the blowout preventer, on BP's well actually shows that it was working as designed and still failed. And the implication from that is the design of BOPs that are being used by industry now is not robust enough to deal with the extremely high pressures of these ultra-deep wells in deep water. That's a serious engineering concern. Nevertheless, based largely on the promise of that, the administration through BOMER has gone ahead and issued at this point 74 deep water drilling permits since October 2010, and they're moving ahead fairly expeditiously now with new leasing plans. Finally, I want this on everybody's radar screen. This is the most significant thing that has happened in U.S. waters related to offshore drilling, and nobody's talking about it. In March, BOMER approved the first ever use in U.S. waters of an FPSO. FPSO, Floating Production, Storage, and Offloading System. What an FPSO is essentially it's a giant floating tank to hold oil or gas produced from wells on the seafloor until some other tanker can come up, take off a load of that, and shuttle it back to shore. In this case, the big tank that's being parked out in the Gulf by Petrobras, Brazil's state oil company, is a converted super tanker. And it can hold hundreds of millions of gallons of crude oil. And what this does is it changes the game for offshore development totally in the Gulf, because instead of having to build and install a $2 to $3 billion platform out in deep water and a whole new pipeline connecting that platform to shore, a 150 mile pipeline, for a third of the cost, or possibly even as little as a tenth of the cost, you can develop that offshore field with an FPSO. That means that all kinds, most of the drilling that's not happening in the world is not happening because it's simply too expensive. Not because of regulations, not because of bad geology. It's just too expensive logistically. This changes the game entirely, not only for the Gulf, but also for any new leasing that happens on the Atlantic coast and in the Arctic Ocean. And darn it, wouldn't you know, just last month, they had a major accident at this installation. It isn't producing yet. One of the things they have to do is they have to build riser pipes from the wells on the seafloor up to this super tanker to bring the oil and gas up to it. That's sitting in water over 8,000 feet deep, beyond the depth, by the way, that those well containment devices are rated to work at. It's sitting in water 8,200 feet deep, and in April, one of those risers collapsed to the seafloor. 8,000 feet of steel just went crashing down to the seafloor. all the operations got halted, and they reported to the National Response Center their first oil spills from this site. They're not even in production yet. Not a very auspicious start for our FPSO technology. Now, most importantly, what hasn't changed? In my mind, the most important thing that hasn't changed is cleanup technology. So we've got some new response technology, but no action at all, apparently, is being taken to improve cleanup technology. We seem to have decided that our cleanup techniques from 40 years ago are what we're stuck with. That's what we're going to have. And I can guarantee the next major oil spill that happens, if we don't get serious about our cleanup technology and capacity, we're going to be seeing these scenes again. People scooping tar balls off the beach. People wiping marsh grass off by hand to try to get out the oil. And unfortunately, these scenes as well. Because right now, we're not doing a thing to improve our ability to clean up a major spill when it occurs. Now, I said those containment devices were going to take 2 to 3 weeks to get out there, assuming they even work. If you have a BP-type blowout, you've got a spill that's 5 times bigger than Exxon Valdez in the water. If we haven't spent any effort improving our cleanup technology, we're going to be stuck with this again. So, will we prevent the next disaster? I don't know. I hope we'll get a lot more serious about being prepared to deal with it when and if it does occur. Thank you.
That was a good word.